Hello and welcome to All Church Sunday School. I'm Shannon Moore. I'm here with
Renee Hoke,
And
ready for All Church Sunday School.
me too. We're having a ball in the online this version and the in-person version. It's just a great way to engage with Scripture, I think.
I think so, and it was about time for me to make my way through James again.
Yes, I love this look at James today.
Me too.
We're looking at chapter 2, and shall we just dive right in?
We should dive.
Okay, so I thought I really wanted us to read the whole chapter today.
Okay.
So
Excellent.
I thought we might just go back and forth on these pages
That's
that
a good
I've
plan.
done. And so why don't you start? This is chapter 2. We're going to hear the first 13 verses.
Right from the beginning. And I think you have chosen a very interesting picture to go along with this first reading.
You shall see why.
All right, James chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. Do you, with your acts of favoritism, really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? For if a person with gold rings and in fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, "Have a seat here, please," while to the one who is poor you say, "Stand there," or "Sit at my feet," have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? For the one who said, "You shall not commit adultery," also said, "You shall not commit murder." Now, if you do not commit adultery, but if you murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
So before we, I feel like, you remember in the Gospel of John when the disciples were like, "This teaching is hard. Who could do this?
Who could do this?"
What kind of comes up for you here as you read through these first 13 verses?
Well, we have as we noted in our introduction, we think this might have been a letter addressed to a marginalized community. And so that whole favoritism of those who have resources over those who do not is very important in this chapter. Thinking about different treatment as we gather. I think of assembly as we gather for worship. How do we treat someone new who comes in? Do we make all these decisions based on how they're dressed? I have to admit to you one observation I made. When I was with the congregation in Kingwood, there was a wonderful new camp built just north of there near Navasota. It was built by the Episcopal Church. And for a while Episcopal congregations were signing up, other congregations got in and got to enjoy this spectacular facility. Just really great place to have our elder retreat, to have our board retreat. And everyone ate together. There were so many groups present at any time. We'd all eat together in the dining room. And as I came in and beheld a collection of disciples and Episcopalians having their meal and looked out over the dining room, I commented to somebody that I bet I could pick out, this is really prejudice of me, I'm illustrating this chapter, I bet I could pick out the disciples by the watches they were wearing. Because there were people in there with really expensive jewelry. I mean, the accessories. You know, even if you're wearing blue jeans and a shirt, there's other things that distinguish you as somebody with resources. And so I made that comment about just the jewelry. Just look at the jewelry, which is, you know, if you come with gold rings, do you get a better table in the camp dining room because of your jewelry? I was just picking out Episcopalians as people who might have more resources.
Yeah. Well, I was a little convicted as well reading this. I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but I remembered in high school there was a scholarship available for for somebody. It wasn't a big scholarship, but it was voted on by the students. And I voted for one of the richest girls in the school, because I wanted to be able to tell her that I had voted for her. She didn't need it. I felt guilty over that. And I'll tell you something else.
That's a very interesting illustration.
And I also think about this quite a bit when we're processing in worship and go sit up on the chancel.
That we're kind of superior to all the people we're passing by, the throngs. Because if you go to Boar's Head, you see how there's sort of a hierarchy of people who go forward and who have finery, and then the more common people come a little bit later. So do you feel like
maybe
you're passing through the common people on your way, and then you climb up some stairs as if you're
right? And it's more
Isaiah in the temple filled with smoke.
Yeah, I don't want to. It's more about how it makes me feel than about how I feel about the people. But as I was looking at N.T. Wright, who we were using his book last week, and so I'm continuing with that. His statements on this, he says that the world is always assessing and categorizing people, but that there should be no social rank in the church, because he says the rich, in James's experience, are likely to be oppressors, and that if we're not careful, that the rich will, if they're not careful, will operate justice on their own terms. And he put justice in quotation marks, by having the best lawyers, by bribing judges, and that sort of thing. And so in the first century, he was saying that the rich were very anxious about this Jesus movement. And they were like, hey, have you forgotten who's in charge here? And James is reminding everybody the answer to that question is Jesus is in charge. Jesus is a king. King Jesus, that all status, pride, possessions, all of that pale in comparison to Jesus, who God has, placed as a king on this kingdom, but that God's kingdom is here. Jesus is the king, and as Jesus has taught, he has re-emphasized that ancient Jewish teaching about loving your neighbor as yourself. That has been sort of the focal point of his ministry.
Jesus becomes the equalizer.
Right.
And those other ways that you had more power or more respect or more focus,
those
all
gone.
Fall away. But I do want to explain to me the murder versus adultery.
Well, the way Wright explains it, he says that, we talked last week about royal law, and we had some questions in the live class about what that means, a royal law. But Wright is saying that that Jesus established a kingdom, and those laws that people who follow Christ, especially the people who were reading this letter, had decided that they were going to follow those rules of Christ. They were royal laws at this point. And so he said breaking the law makes you a rule breaker. And so he compared it to a piece of glass. He said a piece of glass is broken or it's not. And then he said some people, and a tire is flat or it's not. Then he says some people were trying to drive on the flat tire of social prestige rather than the full tire of loving neighbor as self. So
okay.
Yeah, so I think it has to do with, not picking and choosing what you want to do.
We're not having sort of different layers of the Ten Commandments, so that some were, well, that's okay. This happens a lot.
Right.
There were some that had greater weight than others.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. All of us rationalizing how we want to be.
Yeah.
and what we think Jesus really
Really?
emphasized. Jesus didn't really mind so much about that.
Well, we're really going to get into that here. So I really want us to focus on that 13th verse.
Okay.
I'm going to read it again. It says, "Judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy." And then sort of this famous line, "Mercy triumphs over judgment." What does that mean to you? I had a little trouble trying to
Well,
figure that out.
I think that's just Jesus' teaching on forgiveness, right? That we will not be forgiven if we can't forgive. Isn't that a teaching of Jesus?
Yes, but
But I guess that's more.
but it says judgment will be without mercy.
Will be
First.
without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy.
Right. So
So that puts a lot of
right.
emphasis on us, right?
Exactly. He says that God's mercy is sovereign, is going to triumph. And then he gets into this idea, N.T. Wright does, about people coming up with this sort of anything goes theology with the idea that, well, God's going to forgive me. So, for instance, if you think I can discriminate against the poor because God's going to forgive me. I had a friend a long time ago who would make plans to go out and what he would call sin on a weekend with the full intention of asking forgiveness
In
at
church
the
on
end of the
Sunday
weekend.
morning?
Yep. And I asked, "Is this what you're doing?" He said, "Yes."
That's my plan. I'm sticking to it.
So, but Wright says that God will not, that God, if that's the way we're going to live, that God then is forced in a way to be judgmental,
harsh.
to be harsh, because God can't tolerate a world where mercy isn't the rule of life. And so he says, if God is merciful to the unmerciful, then God is being unmerciful to the poor and helpless. And I had to sit with that for a bit.
And then what'd you figure out?
I didn't. I was hoping you would.
Oh, I
you
think
would
this-
know. Isn't that hard?
If God is merciful, then God is
To
being,
the unmerciful, then God is being unmerciful to the poor and helpless.
if there aren't consequences,
Mm-hmm.
everybody suffers. Isn't that what that's saying?
That God can't abide with God's people being unmerciful.
I think I get that now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So,
Mercy over judgment.
Hmm.
This is so. It's very interesting commentary on our ability to make the teaching of Jesus flexible
well, and
and pay attention to what we think we want to pay attention to.
right, and I've talked to some retired clergy and others who have been in the work of, have been in church work, have been serving the church for and God for a long time, and there's a fear that we're getting too loosey-goosey, that anything goes, everything's okay, you really have to believe anything. Have you talked to folks who have expressed that fear?
Yes, but don't you think the oldest generation in the church has always felt things were getting too relaxed? We could go back to
Probably.
the Pilgrims.
Yeah.
And the Pilgrims would have said that too,
Yeah.
right?
And the older I get,
See?
the more I feel myself,
I'm like,
well, that's
look.
not the way we used to do it.
That's a sign. It's a sign you're aging, Shannon.
But it's good to have these discussions and to think about it.
Yes.
Because I think, sometimes we don't think about that, the judgment or the consequences. I'd rather use that word. It makes me feel better. The consequences of not living the life we're called to live. And I don't know what that means ultimately, and nobody can, but I think the idea is not to fear the judgment, but to embrace that merciful light, living in a merciful way.
In a merciful and obedient way. I think we're good at, we want mercy to kind of color between the lines, and so the flexibility we're leaning into, the obedience is the hard part. The obedient life as Jesus called us to live.
Right. But don't you think that often the fear of the judgment overrides the purpose of the teaching? Like, Jesus wants us to open our hearts and to be merciful to our sisters and brothers. Not because we're afraid of some judgment or some punishment, but because we love God and we want to follow in the way of Christ. Right.
That's a demonstration of our love.
Yeah. So just lifting up a couple of Jesus' teachings.
So we should love your friend who is kind of raising Cain on Friday night and praying for forgiveness on Sunday. How did you decide to love that friend who had a racket going? What did you show him mercy, or did you go, knock it off?
Maybe friend was a broad term.
All right.
I just thought I would bring up a couple of Jesus' teachings here as a reminder of where James is getting some of this. Blessed are the poor, woe to the rich, from Luke chapter 6. And then, of course, in Matthew, Jesus says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was welcomed as a stranger, clothed when I was naked, and taken care of when I was sick, and visited when I was in prison. Will you read what Fred Craddock and some others said in a commentary about this text?
Deference toward the rich and denigration of the poor are unacceptable behaviors for those who believe in Jesus. Showing favoritism in these matters is a grievous wrong. The needs of the poor and hungry are not met by proclaiming the faith, but by giving a cup of cold water. This constitutes genuine faith. Good quote.
I like that too. And then Walter Brueggemann and some others in another commentary were talking about church, the modern church, and that congregations, I'm quoting here, define themselves by their friendliness and accessibility rather than by their doctrines. Do you agree with that?
I think doctrine's not a popular word these days.
Yeah. He says for some, to be Christian means a little more than to be nice.
I agree with that.
Yeah. According to James, partiality to the rich contradicts common sense because the rich act to protect themselves, and Christians need to protect themselves by recalling who is their true benefactor. Favoritism is sinful. Another word we don't like. To behave with partiality toward the rich is to violate the command to love the neighbor and to risk violating all of the law. And that's back to the adultery and the murder scenario that James
So any
about.
bias, any demonstration of bias, of lumping a whole group of people into one category and either dismissing them or saying this group is superior, wouldn't we as followers of Jesus always avoid that kind of stereotype, that kind of assuming, that people with resources are not generous when there are many who are?
Right.
Or assuming that people who are poor are automatically generous and maybe they're not.
Right, because James says that God has given the poor better faith. But don't you
Yes.
think that's James exhibiting some judgment as well?
Yes, I do. I do. And so our goal would be not to show partiality in either direction.
And James definitely is.
But to seek to know who people are and to not assume because of the car they drive up in and park in the parking lot that you know who that person is.
Right, or who that church is.
Right.
I mean, it can apply to churches too. I'm sure people have their own preconceived ideas about our congregation, and I know I certainly have my preconceived ideas about other churches and organizations, and it's a good reminder to not not do that.
As a person who graduated from Texas A&M, I regularly face that bias, especially at University Christian Church. Nothing good can come from Nazareth or College Station. Yes, I know.
What's your symbol? Like a horns or something? What is
Gig 'em.
this? Oh, I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know sports.
So you don't judge me?
I don't.
Okay.
No.
Mercy.
All right. So I'm going to let's continue with the rest of this chapter. This is starting at verse 14. Will you read this for us, Renee?
What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by his works. Thus the scripture was fulfilled that said, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead.
So do you think that James thinks that works are important?
I do believe James is leaning into works as a sign of what you believe.
Right. That it
can't help but show in how you live your life.
Right. Otherwise, it's just words.
Right.
And that's what we talked about last week, that the actions are more important than words. And I paused on that for a little bit, but I think I'm coming around to it. I threw in some cartoons here just for a little
Excellent.
little respite. So I got a guy here leaning back on the phone. He says, I haven't even turned my computer on since our new Christian boss told us that we will be judged by our faith and not by our works.
That's funny.
And then there's a kid holding out his hand. He says, I have faith that you give me $10 for the movies. Mom's handing him a broom. Show me your faith by your works.
A very practical application.
And then this is my favorite. We got a pastor who is putting up the church cleaning rotation sign up. And then above it is posted, faith without works is dead. And this is, it works for Derek every time.
That's all about location, location, location. Put it right under that quote.
So, again, leaning into what N.T. Wright said about this passage, he says that James has heard people talking about faith, not as a rich, lively trust in the loving, living God, but rather a shell, an empty affirmation, like a body without a spirit. I really like how he phrased that. He points to that ancient Judaic confession that God is one. And he says saying that doesn't get you anywhere. Even the demons know that that is true, and it scares them to death, but it doesn't do them any good. And this is my favorite. The Jesus-shaped meaning of the confession must translate into Jesus-shaped action. Isn't that great?
I like that. I do like that. It's just an obvious extension to be formed by Jesus' teaching, and then to have that spill over into everything we do, right?
And I love that as we grow in the faith, we grow in the shape of Jesus, so that Jesus-shaped need can be filled by us as we are shaped like Jesus, like a puzzle.
I like that.
Almost.
I like this is a way of thinking about that.
Yeah.
And really visualizing. I like that.
And the way that James puts it. I mean, it's just, we've talked about it, how clear he is and how he gets right to the point. Just saying, be warm and full isn't going to make somebody warm and full.
God bless you.
Yeah. You got to, saying I believe in God is worthless unless it creates a radical change in one's life. Now,
no, there's not a but coming after that, is there?
there's not a but, except, I'll say except.
You're going to have some fine print here that you're going to teach.
Then he goes into the Old Testament for some examples.
2 examples, right.
And I'm not sure these are the greatest examples, but he does lift up Abraham, and I have a picture here, Rembrandt, of the angel stopping Abraham from
Such a difficult
sacrificing
story.
Isaac. I remember years ago when I took preaching with Joey Jeter, one of the students in the class preached on that text, and Dr. Jeter said, well, I have to congratulate you. You've done something I've never done. I've never preached this text, and I never will. He just said, I can't. It's too hard. James, brings up Abraham, the father of the Israelite people. Wright says that, Abraham believed in God's promise of a family even though he was childless. But then he kind of took matters into his own hands, with Hagar.
That's right. Extracurricular.
Right. And then it says he faces and withstands a stern test, and that the faith he had was translated into action. He believed God would do what God had promised and was prepared to put that faith into practice. I don't like it, but I guess that's true.
I know there are different ways of, I remember sitting in a Bible study with adults at one point talking about, I guess we were getting ready to study this part of the Bible, and somebody at the table said, this is my favorite story.
Really?
And everybody leaned in because they had been just even anxious about reading it. Mm-hmm. And she said, I was taught in Sunday school, God always provides a way. And that's what God did in that story. And so that as a small child, she remembers a Sunday school teacher who said it with great confidence, God provides a way. And so she hadn't really, I don't think, unpacked, why would God require that of Abraham?
Right, even as a test.
But if you teach it as God provides a way, there's always a way out. So her focus was the resolution at the end and not the assignment
right.
that Abraham had been given. So she was just worked out just fine, didn't it? Just like, oh my gosh.
Oh.
But that's a difficult, what Abraham was willing to do was sacrifice his son. Those are the works that James is,
according to N.T. Wright,
lifting up.
Yes, that James
was willing,
is saying
Abraham
that
was willing to do whatever God told him to do.
Put the money where the mouth is.
Yeah.
Yep. And then he also raises up somebody near and dear to our heart.
Rahab,
who you talked about in the last series.
It hasn't been so long since we talked about Rahab.
It hasn't, and I pulled that same woodcut, I think, that that we talked about when we looked at Rahab.
There they are sneaking down the building.
Wright says that she's an unlikely example of faith as a pagan prostitute. You may remember that she protected 2 of Joshua's scouts in Jericho when they were getting ready to take over and come into the promised land, because she had come to believe in Israel's God as the one true God and translated that belief into action, even though it was very risky. And then, Renee, I could not help myself. I had to give it its own page. Wright says, Rahab seems to have married an Israelite and become, remarkably enough, the great-great-grandmother of King David, and hence part of the family tree of Jesus himself.
I found a timeline and something else I was working on after we struggled with, could she really be? Yes.
But you had come to the conclusion, hadn't you, that timeline-wise, it would be difficult for that to be?
Yes, but, there was no dating of that story. There was no, remember, we couldn't really, so we couldn't say it wouldn't work. We just couldn't say.
So have you come back over to my side?
I'm going to go that she's in the genealogy of Jesus. That's your side?
Yeah.
Or maybe that's the Lord's side. Not yours. You didn't make it up. So I guess I had fallen away from the Lord when I was doubting that.
Right. I think that's right.
Well, that's very judgmental of you. And mercy triumphs judgment. Shannon, you're a living example of the letter of James.
I feel like I just lost a star out of my crown to get it back. Again, talking about this idea of translating belief into action, even when it's impossible or dangerous, is faith that matters. That it justifies. What does that mean to you? Justifies. Validates. It saves. It says in verse 14. And then Wright says, got to make sure that your faith is the real thing, that it does what it says on the packet. Isn't that cool? I love that.
Authentic faith.
And I put your little endurance plant.
I hope that you will refrain
from last week.
From plucking.
I haven't plucked any
Good
plants out of the sidewalk crack this week. Will you read, this is the last quote that I have for this week, but this is Walter Brueggemann again from another commentary, what he says about this.
Faith and works cannot be divorced from each other. Concrete acts are needed rather than pious benedictions. Too much has been made of James' supposed emphasis on works as proving faith, assuring salvation. It's not an algorithm by which salvation is attained or faith proved. It's addressing behaviors that faith can exist alongside indifference to human need.
And so this indifference to human need is what James is pointing us away from, that we can't live in that indifferent way in the face of seeing people suffer. That we have to, if we're going to say that we're following Christ, if we're going to claim that name, to be part of that kingdom, that realm, that we have to show mercy in the face of suffering.
We can't just sit in the pew on Sunday morning and
say,
feel like we've taken care of it.
Right. You gotta do something. Woo.
So I think this leads me, as we think about who wrote James, and if it was James, the brother of Jesus, and he was speaking to sort of a diaspora group that had been in Jerusalem and had to flee because of persecution. They're already suffering, and it doesn't seem like it would make sense to take them to task.
Right.
So what are you saying then? That means that James, the brother of Jesus, didn't write the letter.
Not necessarily. I think I like the idea that it was Jesus' brother.
But I just gave you a good argument why. If it's Jesus' brother, he's writing to a group that has fled the area, left everything behind because of persecution that was breaking out. And so they're already suffering.
Right.
And he's cautioning them against, I would think that their faith is being tested, and I don't know, it just seems like they would be in the group that's struggling and needs compassion.
Well, but maybe that's what he's doing, is giving them some hope for, that mercy is going to rule the day.
Reminding the people around them to care for them, because they would be struggling. Mm-hmm. So you would pick and choose this lesson, this turned into a sermon, for particular occasions and particular locations, wouldn't you? You wouldn't go preach faith without works in a neighborhood where everybody's struggling to survive, would you? You would preach where people are a little relaxed.
Maybe so.
And a little, turned in on themselves.
But don't you think everybody has the duty to show mercy? No matter our circumstances, we're bound to run into somebody who needs to be shown mercy. So do you think mercy
is the same as generosity?
They're definitely related. I don't know if they're the same.
Kindness, generosity, compassion.
I mean, they're all in the same family. I don't know if
It's tricky because we don't really use mercy as much.
right.
But it's bigger than any single one of those words, right? It's bigger than
Right,
that.
because it's got, on the flip side of what we're talking about, it can't just be works either, right? I mean, you can be a generous, merciful person without that being tied to a faith, right?
Let me just tell you this story. I know we're almost out of time. I went with a group of adults from a previous congregation down to the Guatemalan border, and we spent a week building a house out from the nearest village, a house next to a rural school, so the teacher during the week could live next to the school and then go back into town for the weekend. And so the parents, the mothers and fathers in that rural area were thrilled that we were there. That would make it possible for them to get a good teacher for the upcoming school year. And so all the dads showed up and were there waiting on our first day of work. And what we noticed immediately is that we had all brought tools with us and they didn't have any. And so for a day, because we were knuckleheads, they held things while we, who couldn't do that, who were not skilled at construction, kept control of the tools and did all of and at the end of the day, we thought, and they were just happy to help in any way. Can I carry this? Can I hold this so that you can hammer? And we were making such slow progress, we thought, we will not be finished this week. And so at the end of the day, we handed all of the tools over and we held and their skill was far superior to ours.
Right. What a great story.
Isn't that and why did it take us a full day? I think at the end of the day, when we saw how little we had done and how kind they had been to stay all day long and just take a secondary role, and then we're like, all right. And when we made that decision, here, you take the tools, we'll hold the stuff. We finished the house by the end of the week.
That's amazing. I love that story.
Isn't that... I just think of all of the assumptions so easy for us to make when we have access to resources, to just assume we're doing it the right way. And probably it was so dramatically the wrong way to go about that project.
But you figured it out.
We did, but we should have figured it out in the first 5 minutes.
But
it took us a whole day.
It could have taken you the whole week, though. So
yes.
you know what we should have done on that trip?
Why didn't we give the tools to the people with the skill? Yeah.
Oh, well, we want to hear from you.
We really need to hear from you.
We did hear from a few of you last week, but we need to hear from more of you. We want to know about you, about how you found All Church Sunday School, how long you've been watching, when do you watch, what would you like for us to talk about in future topics. So email us, acss@uccftw.com. I bet Austin has put that graphic right there on the screen.
That's right. Or you can scan the code, right?
Because we're fancy.
We know our stuff.
All right. Well, do you feel empowered to put your faith into action?
I do. In fact, I'm going on a mission trip.
You certainly are. You are putting your faith into action.
I'm going with the Cairo, the middle school
kids. The middle schoolers.
And we're going to go work at Target Hunger in Houston and learn about food insecurity and work in their community garden and pack boxes that are going to be delivered by, what is one of the places that what are the delivery service that delivers from restaurants?
Like DoorDash or Uber Eats or something like that?
I think it's DoorDash.
Okay.
Prepare boxes that DoorDash takes to seniors who are homebound.
Wonderful. That's
great.
great.
So we're going out to put our faith into action.
Yay.
I'll tell you about it when I get back.
Can't wait. Hope you have a great rest of your week and that you've been inspired to put your faith into action. Read chapter 3 for next week, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.